the United States of America launched a full-scale invasion to seize the nation of Greenland. Unfortunately, they got confused and ended up in Greenland, New Hampshire, which is in the United States already. This consisted of a county of roughly 4,000 people being woken up at 2 a.m. to see 400,000 American troops and about $700 billion worth of taxpayer money and military equipment just sitting outside their homes. The US, of course, immediately realized their mistake and corrected course, and an hour later they were at the real Greenland, in Arkansas. The US military immediately fired their head of navigation, and finally, they left the US to go to Greenland. For real, this time, and yeah, you guessed it, they ended up at New Zealand somehow. Naturally, the US immediately conquered New Zealand, and then asked a few locals for directions, and finally, set forward to reach the real Greenland. At the same time that the US was making these blunders, Russia launched their own invasion on Greenland. However, due to language barriers, they ended up conquering Iceland. And China saw an opportunity and finally launched their invasion of Taiwan, except they also got confused and ended up conquering the Philippines instead. However, while they were invading the Philippines, Taiwan went and invaded China and conquered it. So the Philippines was now China, and China was now Taiwan, and the Taiwan was actually now the US because America misunderstood the directions they had gotten from New Zealand and ended up at Taiwan conquering it instead. The UN, who was watching all of this live, said, "We would write a strongly worded letter condemning these actions. However, we have no idea what's happening, and frankly, we are kind of scared." The following months was a three-way war, with all three countries fighting each other. For China and Taiwan, it was about getting their homeland back. And for the US, it was because it thought that the Philippines might be Greenland and that the Chinese had just beat them to it. A few months later, and somehow things had gotten even more confusing. Taiwan had ended up taking over the Philippines, and the US had ended up taking over all of Korea. Korea had ended up in China, and China had ended up on the island of Taiwan. This was met by another comment from the UN, this time saying, "We finally figured out what was happening, but we couldn't figure out what to write in the strongly worded letters, so we just picked out a sorry for your loss card at CVS and sent one to all of you." After some weeks of negotiations, the three nations agreed that this was just stupid, and decided to swap back to their original countries. This put China back in China, Taiwan back in Taiwan, Korea back in Korea, and the US was in the Philippines now. Granted, they only agreed to these negotiations because they thought that the Philippines was Greenland. But at this point of time, the US had finally, actually, for real this time, I promise, figured out where Greenland was, and they set their army forth to start the real invasion. Greenland, however, had had time to actually prepare for an invasion. As they had watched the US try to invade them for the past year, they spent that time preparing. Greenland's main preparations for defense are exactly what you'd expect from a lesser military force preparing for a greater military invasion. They took all of the natural resources that the US was trying to invade them to get, all of their manpower, and they built a Jaeger, specifically recreating the Gypsy Danger from the film Pacific Rim. When the US finally invaded, it can only be described as one of the most brutal Navy defeats in all of human history. The mech was throwing smaller boats at aircraft carriers, billions of dollars were sunk. I mean, it went as poorly as it could have for the US. Unfortunately, however, despite the Navy being defeated by the mech, the US Air Forces were still able to make it untouched to Greenland and begin the land invasion. Airdropping troops and vehicles, and with the mech being too damaged from the Navy battle, it was pretty much a lost cause. Greenland wasn't able to hold out long in this ground invasion, and fell within only a week. Fortunately, however, Greenland had actually planned for all of this. They had moved most of their forces to Canada before the invasion, and once the US was locked into combat, they invaded the US and took it over. On top of that, they had installed thrusters onto the entire landmass of Greenland and launched it into space, with the majority of the US Army on it, leaving Greenland as the new rulers of the US and most of the American Army in orbit around the Earth.